I am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs, where I interview Jonathan Gardner. He has experience from powerful brands like Starbucks, Dell Computers, Albertsons, and General Motors, and he's brought that experience to mid-market and medium-sized companies in his new company as founder of J. Gardner Group. He leverages his insider knowledge as a former mega buyer to help mid-market companies land lucrative deals with Fortune 500 companies. He knows exactly what those giants are looking for and how to get deals pushed through. During this interview, we discuss his background growing up in a small town and having the dream to be an international deal maker. Jonathan describes his personal journey and the ups and downs of obtaining his goals and what he learned along the way. I think you're going to enjoy his story and relate to so many of the things that Jonathan is talking about, of his goals that he wanted to achieve and what reality meant when you achieve those goals. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs. Today I'm with Jonathan Gardner. And Jonathan, do you want to give a little background on yourself before we get started?
I sure would like to. Thank you so much. Yeah, I run my own boutique consultancy called the J. Gardner Group. I got to this point maybe by a path that's a bit unique in that when I finished my international MBA and law degree, I decided that I wanted to go into supply chain and strategic sourcing. And I did that through several years at first General Motors, then Dell Computers, and then Starbucks, and finally Albertsons. And along the way, I learned from the procurement side a lot about a variety of different industries, how deals get done, what things cost, et cetera. And then right around the time of COVID, I found myself in a position where I had the opportunity to do this. And it is literally forcing me to unlearn some things, learn some new tricks while hanging on to what made me successful up to this point.
Awesome. Well, that's a great lead in to understand your story. So why don't you just start off telling me where you grew up and what your parents did for a living, a little bit about your family?
Hey, I grew up in a small town near Greenville, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
My father was had a supply chain job with Westinghouse or one of their derivatives. Um, and let's see, I was in that small town of Malden, South Carolina, until I went to college. I went to school at the University of South Carolina. My undergrad degree was in political science. And by the time my junior and senior year rolled around, I had a job selling swimming pool chemicals and renovation work. And this was back in 1992 or three, somewhere in there. And I thought I was the bomb because I think I was making $500 a week, and that was a lot when
Yeah.
you were worried about maybe a little bit of rent, but a lot of going out on the weekend. But as graduation approached, I realized that wasn't going to cut it, and so that decided me to evaluate where I wanted to be in life. And at that time, I thought I want to be an international deal maker, and I didn't really know what that meant. It just sounded cool, like James Bond with a laptop
Uh-huh.
and no guns, that sort of thing. And so I applied for and got into still at the University of South Carolina, the International Master of Business program, which is
Mhm.
highly rated, and then also the law program or the Juris Doctor, which it's a 4-year combined degree. And that set me up for a bunch of things that were important. Uh, I think most critically to the story of my life and career, I learned Portuguese as part of the schooling, and I did that partially at the university, but mostly in São Paulo, Brazil, in the big city of São Paulo, um, with language training, and then during my internship at General Motors of Brazil. And so that combined experience of working for a big company, the language, giant farm. I'm kind of a small town guy. That really shook me up a bit and shaped some of my other experiences. Let me
Yeah.
pause right there to see if you want to dive in.
So let's go back a little and talk about your dad. So
Okay.
what were how were you involved with the things that he did and learned about supply chain?
I wasn't terribly involved. I was aware of
Hmm.
what he did. I was aware that he worked long, hard hours and there was always something going wrong.
Yeah.
Um, and he worked to provide a way to live
Right.
rather than living to work. And
Right.
so I observed how that maybe say lack of strategic focus on career, what it
Mhm.
does for you and what it doesn't do for you. And I determined to spend my life differently. In fact, when I was applying to the honors college as an 18-year-old, young men, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, I don't know, but I know what I don't want to do. I don't want to work as a material management guy in some giant corporation chasing parts. And it was funny, like 8 years later, I found myself at 2 a.m. at a supplier, literally across the highway from where he used to work. And the supplier I was visiting had some crisis. Their line went down, whatever. And so I'm banging out this report at 2 a.m. for what's going to happen to General Motors' network of factories. I look up and I'm looking at my dad's old office, about 300 yards away. And I went, oh man, all that school, and I'm doing what he did, which is chase parts. So it
Funny
was
how life works out.
exactly. So I it kind of accidentally fell into his career. But what I've done differently, and I'm going to share some things I wish I'd done, I suspect, on this program. I put a lot more emphasis on career in life so that the economic flexibility that I would have later in life would be different than his. And so that was yeah, I got a lot of learnings out of my old
Yeah.
man, whether I intended to or not.
So what was it? Because like that focus, you weren't necessarily watching, to be able to see that. What was it that triggered that? Was it that you were living in a small town, or there were things that you wanted and you couldn't get, or time spent with him? Like, what was it that was making that goal in your head to not have the same type of life?
Was a real drive to accomplish things, to conquer something big and difficult, the
Mhm.
intellectual challenge of it. I think part of that challenge was coming from a town that at the time could be generously described as a mud puddle with a traffic light or two. I wanted to get out of that, and I read about big business, and I
Okay.
understood it from that
Where were you
perspective.
reading?
Sorry,
Where were you reading it? Like, what were
where was
you
I?
that was giving you that view?
Well, I for the longest time, I mean, in high school, I would say I was reading just normal high school stuff. I
Mhm.
did get pulled into Ayn Rand, believe it or not. She was
Oh,
one of the
true.
authors that helped me appreciate hyper
Yeah.
capitalism and long for a business elite that behaved as well as some of
Yeah.
her heroes. We won't talk about
So,
that right now.
which book was your favorite?
Uh, well, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead were the,
Yeah.
you know, I think I read both of them two or three times. And so I had this hyper capitalist mentality. And I
Yeah.
suppose I wanted to be a captain of industry and,
Hmm.
didn't know what that meant, but it sounded cool coming from Ayn Rand's pen.
Yeah. How did you even get into Ayn Rand? Because I got it because my mom gave it to me to start reading when I was, I don't know, junior high, high school. But how did you get it? Was it an assignment in school, or how did you even know about it?
Took a class, I want to say as a sophomore in high school, which had some upperclassmen in it. And a guy that I admired a lot um, said, you need to read Ayn Rand.
Huh.
And
Yeah.
it stood out as a smart guy that was with it. He was going somewhere on an academic scholarship. And I was like, okay, if it's good enough for Marty, was his name,
Mhm.
I'll give it a shot. And it really did shape me. And I had
Yeah.
no idea that Alan Greenspan was her muse back in the day. Found that out later. But just the story of Ayn Rand breaking out of Russia, and no matter what regime is there, the thinking I think has always been kind of damped down. But to really absorb that, what she her messages and what she had to offer, it did inspire me. And I always liked studying language, Spanish in high school, and I
Mhm.
was always curious about the world beyond Malden, South Carolina. And so I think that
Yeah.
curiosity and drive, with a lot of, let's say, fertilization and inspiration from Ayn Rand,
Yeah. Isn't
that
that amazing? Like I feel the same way. Like I was actually given those books to as an example of strong women in business. So that like you weren't seeing that as much, and she was so before her time with women, being in this corporate environment, running businesses and so forth. And so like those books gave me a visual of what a woman possibility could be. And so it's just interesting, you as a man, what you took from it as well, and that it is something that you don't realize how much these little things shape you as you go through life.
it's interesting to hear you express it that way. And
Yeah.
I think as a you mentioned, what a woman, what you got out of it versus
Yeah.
what I got out of it. I suppose by luck of the draw, male, blonde hair, blue eye, that I haven't really been exposed much to some of the pressures and obstacles that the people that look different and have different
Yeah.
body parts, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
have exposed. For me, Ayn Rand, it was never about gender. It was always about what hyper capitalism, by promoted and driven by people with good intent and the desire to do good in the world, can and should do, kind of despite the obstacles. Um, I learned a bit more about the perspective you touched on over time. And frankly, when I lived in Brazil, I had an experience which, like, um, well, I just got maybe one thousandth of and I'm blanking on the name of the civil rights lady that sat on the Rosa Parks. I feel like
Hmm.
I got one millionth of a percent of the Rosa Parks experience when, I got on a bus at some bus stop going from A to B in Sao Paulo. And I was the guy that looked different.
Hmm.
Um, and the bus was empty when I got on. I sat down. Well, the bus filled up. People are standing in the aisle. No one would sit beside me.
Hmm.
No one. And they're all looking at me like, who's the gringo? Who's the random white guy in the crowd?
Yeah.
We don't see people like this on this bus. So eventually I gave up the seat for a lady that had a bag, handful of bags and a child or something. As I stood up, people just
Separated.
made space. And at that moment, I went, okay, I got it.
Hmm.
I'm glad I only got one millionth of that
Right.
experience. I don't know how I would have dealt with the full meal
Mhm.
deal, but that was, and some other things I learned in my 8 months living in Sao Paulo. Those were formative moments. So Ayn Rand meets some humility and awareness that
Yeah.
I'm not always going to get the run of the green. Were key moments in my life.
Yeah. Well, and I think uh what's interesting is each person's perspective, but what that did for you versus me was you had never seen something beyond a small town. And so it was giving you that visual of like shoes you haven't walked in before, and same for me, right? And then even the experience on the bus is, shoes you haven't walked in before, and trying to have that understanding and carry it with you. So, um, was that why you wanted to go international, or what was it about the international piece that was so important to you?
I wish I could give you a great answer. The best answer I can give you is there was something uh, fun, magical, just exhilarating about studying Spanish. I took the
Yeah.
normal, high school Spanish classes anyone else did, and
Hmm.
I suppose was a good enough student at it. It sure felt cool. And so when you take the Ayn Rand experience, of reading those books and devouring, um, reading about history, recognizing that the world surely had to be larger than a town with three traffic lights and seven fast food joints. I just knew something was out there, and I've always been a fan of movies and whatnot, and so like I said at the outset, literally watching James Bond, this glamorous, well-dressed guy, gallivant around the world, I was like, well, I don't want to do that, and that's
Yeah.
not even real. But man, maybe I can take my attraction to commerce,
Uh-huh.
um, under intellectual underpinnings, if you will, from Ayn Rand and
Mhm.
good hypercapitalism, this growing love for languages. Maybe I can do something with that
Yeah.
and get out of this town.
Yeah, exactly. And then one other person you brought up was Marty. What was it that you thought was something to strive for? Why did he make a mark in your head?
Was he was cool, organized, going somewhere, um, but he wasn't over the top about it. Some
Hmm.
people are, they're going to be politicians because their hair is perfect and they're beautiful
Right.
and this, that, and the other. He was a real guy. I think he was a wrestler, and so he
Hmm.
was fit. I forget which. He probably went to one of the Southern Ivies, like Davidson or Emory or something like
Right.
that. But he got a ride to a school that I had heard of but didn't understand. And he was really intelligent, and he challenged me in some ways. And in this one class, I can remember I knew nothing. I was 15, he was 17 or 18.
Yeah.
He mentioned something like, the Reagan administration has been the most imperialist administration since whatever. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, but that's like, that sounded cool. I want to know what that means. And so when he later said, go read Ayn Rand, I'm like, okay, well, this guy knows some stuff that I don't know. He's put
Right.
together and organized in a way that I'm not yet. And I've never talked to him since. So
I
it's
know.
not like a lifelong friendship, but
Yeah.
that's one guy
But
at age
it's always
17.
amazing how you don't even know. Like he doesn't know he left a mark on you and you've left a mark on people, but like it's those little things that we pepper along the way that, we kind of forget is our quilt that is how we're made up, you know?
It is. And you said something there at the end is, yes, people make marks on us and we can
Mhm.
feel those marks.
Right.
We do make marks on other people. And sometimes we're fortunate enough to get feedback from them,
Hmm.
as to what they liked, what they didn't. If
Right.
it's an intimate relationship, hopefully they're giving you that. And there are many other cases where, I've gathered or maybe heard over time where the mark I made was positive and inspiring. And in other cases, it probably wasn't. And I may have said something in a rushed or
Mhm.
brusque manner, not thinking much, that hurt someone's feelings.
Right.
And as you get older, you recognize that inspiration from unlikely sources runs both ways. And we should
Yes.
take care.
Exactly. So, okay, so let's go back to so you were at General Motors in Brazil. How did you navigate an organization like that coming from South Carolina?
It totally blew my mind. I had no idea, what a giant company meant.
Hmm.
I worked all through high school and college. I've been working pretty much without breaks since I was, I think, 13 years old. But for me, the small companies I worked for, literally, it was unload the delivery truck, stack boxes, reload the truck, deliver to the site, get a signature, and move on, et cetera. And so and I would observe the owners doing their things, but it was sell the project manage it. And
Right.
so for me, it was, you had to do it all. Well, you drop into General Motors, and even in a subsidiary like GM Brazil, there's a department for everything, a
Hmm.
process and a procedure for everything. There are steps to follow. There are people at every level that can help you. You have to be at the right level to get there. And so I saw this world of just intense and dense administration, and sometimes all the way to bureaucracy.
Mhm.
And it I didn't learn really until I'd been out of General Motors and landed at Dell how important knowing how to work a big administration, big bureaucracy really is. I kind of took
Mhm.
it for granted. So I had this shock and awe.
Mhm.
And while I was there, I never really learned how to work it, never really learned those skills. And then once it was gone, I was like, oh, I should have learned that
Yeah. So how did you learn it at Dell?
the hard way.
Okay.
And so when I left General Motors, I left a career track. I'd been recruited and got moved around to all these jobs and had mentors in the whole 9 yards.
Mhm.
Um, but I gave up a career in exchange for a job. Now, the job paid better. It was in Austin instead of Detroit, which sounded better.
Mhm.
And it was in a growth company as opposed to a company managing for attrition. However, in Dell, I didn't have the connections. They didn't come pre-wired for me. And I didn't know how to get things done strategically in an organization.
Mhm.
And related to that, I didn't know how to negotiate with my own company for my own benefit. I knew how
Right.
to negotiate with suppliers, but not for me.
Mhm.
And so I made a couple of mistakes that I don't think cost the company any money, but they cost me some internal political credibility. And it
Right.
took me a while to climb out of that. And eventually I did with some help, which I imagine you'll get me to tell you about in a minute. But it was the not knowing how to do it, banging my head against the wall and realizing I've got a problem. I've got to do something to address this problem if I want to do what I set out to do, which is to become an international deal maker.
So, yeah, so we talk a lot about this concept of 100% responsibility, and I think when you get in those situations, like, and many people do in their careers where they're blaming the outside, for their, what's not working instead of stepping back and saying, what's my 100% responsibility? Like, what can I shift? And that's where it kind of sounds like you were heading. So how did you get the help, and what things did you learn to shift to turn it around?
You are spot on, and I do have an excellent answer for this one. So I was on my second team at Intel, and I was learning a lot about the work.
Hmm.
Still hadn't gotten to working the relationships in the organization. And so my boss suggested, and he heard my frustration and my ambition, and he suggested that I do a 360-degree review. And I
Hmm.
did. 22 people responded, and there was one question, like, is Jonathan strategic or tactical? 21 people wrote strategic. One person wrote tactical. I could tell based on the responses of the one person that said tactical was my boss. And so I
Hmm.
sat down to review that with him and put this on the table. What's there's a gap here,
Yeah.
thinking like you've got a gap in your awareness of how strategic I am. That
Right.
was what was the tape I was playing in my mind. And he said, okay, yeah, let's talk about this and take out your phone. It was a flip phone at the time. Okay. Show me the numbers of all the VPs here at Dell you can call that will pick up the phone or call you right back. Crickets. Okay. How about directors? I said, well, blah, blah, blah. Okay. What about those that you don't work with every single day? What happens? A big project, like you got a problem to solve and you need John or Jane, VP of whatever, you need them. How are you going to approach the problem? I said, well, I'll get on their calendar, I'll prepare a deck, I'll explain it. Da, da, da. Okay, so you wait until you have a tactical problem to establish a relationship
And
with you.
do it in a tactical way.
Right. And I said, well, yeah, I don't want to waste their time. He says, okay, that's why you're tactical, and you will never be anything but tactical until you change your perspective. And
Mhm.
I think it took me a year before my ego was ready to do something with that feedback. But I did something eventually. That was back in 2000 and I don't know, 6 or 7 maybe.
Mhm.
And so I spoke with the administrator or the consultant, whatever, that helps you interpret the 360s, talk through the problem, and she asked me, "Are you willing to do whatever it takes to address this?" A deep breath. I said, "Yes." So I'm not getting anywhere. And so she gave me the name and number of a person that I subsequently worked with for 7 years. And this lady was a fantastic, I think her academic credentials were a licensed clinical social worker. So she
Mm.
wasn't a psychologist, but her practice was around helping people. And sometimes these were kids out of rough situations. And other times she had an Olympic pole vaulter that she coached through success visualization. So there's like a wide range. And most people were just kind of boring guys like me in the middle that wanted to get better at stuff. I started working with her and literally had to rewire the way I react to certain environments so that I could show up in a way that would help me be more effective for my company and eventually really calm down the monkey mind that some of us have kind of chattering away as background noise at all time. Really get past that so that I
Mhm.
could be an effective professional at the level that I wanted to play. And I got to tell you, Amy, it was hard. And yeah, we
Mm.
dug up stuff from, when you're a little kid,
Yeah.
like, it always goes back to mama. But the
Mhm.
point being is without the frustrations of like at GM, I was kind of promoted because there was an infrastructure that I was hired into.
Right.
At
More
Dell, it was
militaristic. Yeah.
right. It was kind of a blood sport. It was results oriented. And had I not made that move and beat my head against the wall a dozen times, gotten the tough feedback, and then eventually done something with it, I never would have gotten out of that rut that I was in, which kind of goes back to what you touched on, which is this victim mindset that
Mhm.
we can find ourselves in sometimes.
Yes. There's so many good things there. I just love, like, again, people that make an impact on you. This boss, that he took the time to explain strategic in a different way than most people explain it. Um, I think that is so, I've never heard that before. That is definitely something I'm going to remember. But, um, when you think strategy, you think like strategy on a deck and business strategy. And that's why other people were saying, yes, you're strategic. You're coming up with strategy for the work you do. And I find it fascinating how we can have the same word but interpret it in different ways. Where he interpreted, yes, you build a strategy, but you execute it tactically instead of like going out and making relationships. And this to me is one of the things I see over and over in the coaching that I do is people really resist building relationships. Like they don't want to take the time away from the work, right?
Right.
Like, but it is the work. You just don't
It is the
realize
work.
it's the work.
And I, I don't know if some of your clients or patients or however you think of them, your friends, I don't know how it goes for them, but I can tell you for me, um, there was real deep-seated anxiety and
Hmm.
sometimes even fear
Hmm.
of creating those new relationships. And I noticed and the feedback tracked with it that I did well in business one-on-one and in
Hmm.
really big group settings, like I could always give a speech in front of 500 people and wouldn't bother me. But it was that medium sized setting, which,
Hmm.
below 20, where it's small enough to be intimate, but the exchanges, there are a lot of opinions in the room. There's a whole lot of who's watching who. Those situations, and depending upon the title in the room, the differences in authority and express authority, those would lead me to experience anxiety and clam up.
Hmm.
Um, and when I would clam up, I would either say nothing or say it way too abruptly, like
Hmm.
bombastically. And this person, her name was Carol, that worked with me all those years, really helped me, frankly, develop new synopses. So in new pathways, so that when events would occur in the environment, instead of claiming up or becoming angry guy, I could navigate effectively in the middle. And it's been a long time since I've been working on this, but nevertheless, it was those situations are what helped me get through this and develop some skills that without all this help, I wouldn't have been able to get to on my own. That's for sure.
Well, and just knowing what triggers you have, like, so that you can mentally prepare before going into a room like that. Do you think any of it had to do with confidence or imposter syndrome coming from a small um town where you felt like you were in a bigger environment than your family's ever seen, and they might figure that out at one point, as well? Because there was something in your head young thinking bigger was better and something was wrong with being small, right? Like
Yeah.
just in the way that you processed. So you just kept going, putting yourself in these huge environments, but it's just interesting.
It is, and so there's imposter syndrome is an interesting way to put it. Lack of confidence relative
Mhm.
to that. For sure, there's something there. Malden is my hometown, if you will, is a working class suburb of a small city in a small poor state.
Yeah.
So it's small, stacked and stacked and stacked. And so there certainly was something there. I could tell you something else on a more personal level, and I was able to recognize the impact once I became a parent. Is that when you get good grades and you're kind of
Mhm.
the golden boy and you're being raised by a single parent, you have a lot of people, or I had a lot of people around me praising me for getting good grades and for being smart.
Hmm.
Um, and so if you praise a kid for getting good grades or having good outcomes on their projects, they can become afraid to take on bigger things because they might not get a good grade. And his
Right.
self-worth in mommy or daddy's or teachers or coach's eyes gonna drop if I go for calculus 2 honors and only get a C in it.
Right.
So there was something there.
Yeah.
And so I kind of heard, wow, you're special all going along. And I didn't ever want to not be special.
Right.
Um, and like I said, this was only when trying to learn how to become a better parent did I realize, man, not only am I doing things wrong as a parent, we've learned a lot as a society since I was a kid. And
Yeah.
so I think those
Hmm.
experiences as a kid, as well as small
Yeah.
town,
Uh-huh.
those probably did add up to a chip on the shoulder and a little bit of an underdog syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I was also wondering about the titles thing, since it bothered you being in a room like that. Did anything from being a GM drive that? Because I know that's probably a more um level status driven place where it, maybe certain levels don't speak to certain levels or aren't in a room with certain levels, or you hadn't been in a room with certain levels with at the GM job.
Think it actually was more Dell.
Really?
I was too naive to get it at
Hmm.
GM.
Yeah.
That's probably where I should have learned those
Yeah,
skills,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
didn't. When I got to Dell, as I mentioned, I gave up a career for a better paying job
Right.
and got everything that I'd hoped and feared. More money, growth company, better climate, but
Right.
not a career. And I saw some peers moving up. I felt like I had some, I'll say, political and communication missteps that cost me an opportunity early on. And I became frustrated, perhaps even
Mm-hmm.
bitter about that. And
Mm.
it was right there. It's like, wait a minute, I was at a certain level. I thought I would be. I'm not. I'm stuck. And then as time went on and Dell was shifting jobs to China, cutting jobs in the US, that next level job was always just out of touch.
Mm-hmm.
Great bonus modifier, great stock options, all that stuff, but I couldn't get the next title. And that just wore on me after a
Yeah.
while and eventually became a thing.
Yeah, where it's just replaying in your head all the time. Yeah, I actually was just in a conversation with some managers talking, well, and he had had more of a military background, but um he was talking about a staff person that worked for him that wanted to get to the next level, and he could not understand like why there was such a drive or a focus to get to the next level, it's just like, just take your time, like, whatever. And I'm like, but if you're driven that way, like someone like you, someone like me, that person, like you've got to have forward motion. Like even if it's not a title, where you're still giving someone responsibility to know you see them as something special, right?
No, as you told that story, something else came up out of the past, and I'll label the following as arrogance on my part. Um, Although I was probably not wise enough to call it arrogance at the time. When I've worked for people that don't get it,
Hmm.
then my sky high expectations that I project on everyone, myself, my dog, my wife, my son,
Hmm.
employees, clients, you name it. Those sky high expectations when I would work for someone, and inevitably you do, that just doesn't get it, or,
Yeah.
or or they don't know how to do what you know how to do, and
Yeah.
obviously they know how to do something that you don't, but you can't see it. I would get really frustrated when the boss was dumb,
Yeah.
and that that was not healthy, and so I internalized that with, okay, I've at least got to get to that level, because if
Right.
that nitwit can do it, I mean, so I'm not describing anything that was healthy on that side. I'm just
Right.
being just raw with you in that,
Yeah.
yeah, there was an arrogance element to it. And there was a book that I read along the way, right around the time I was figuring out how to overcome these
Hmm.
foibles. And it was called The Other End of the Leash. It was about dogs, except it was
Okay.
also about people. And there was a little clip in there that I'll recall, and that dogs, like primates, therefore like people, some need to be the alpha and will fight to the death to get there. Some don't want to be alpha and they're fine being the low dog on the totem pole. And there are other dogs that just need to be in the middle. Um, and it went on and described, offered some metaphors into political life and company life. And I went,
Yeah.
okay, that's me. I don't need to be alpha, but I sure as hell can't be this guy.
Yeah.
Like, I work too hard to be
Yeah.
stuck where I am. So I realized, okay, this is yet another signal. And kind of concurrent with that book on dogs, I was still playing soccer at a very amateur level, the Austin over 30 B B
Yeah.
division men's team type deal. I would play against guys that no matter what I did, they were just better than me. They were faster, quicker. I couldn't touch them on a
Yeah.
field. And I was looking at work, going, okay, well, there are people in this organization making 1 million or 2 or 3 a year, and I was stuck in low six figures. Well, they probably have something. It's just not as easy to see as foot speed is on a soccer field. And
Right.
so these things, the 360, the book about dogs, the awareness on the soccer field, they just all came together with, like, okay, dude, you've got some blind spots. We need to figure them out and do something with them.
Yeah. And it can be the simplest thing, like making relationships. I mean, I'm saying it's not simple, but it's not the technical skill all of the time that gets you that to that next rung. So so maybe you can give us a little background of how you got to where you are today and what you're doing now.
Absolutely. So I mentioned General Motors, Dell. After Dell, I went to Starbucks.
Hmm.
And so Starbucks, I got relationship. So think process
Immediately came.
orientation,
Yeah.
results orientation, people orientation. And so fortunately, Dell made me aware of blind spots. And even more fortunately, at Starbucks, for about a 5 or 6 year period, I worked for two managers, two leaders, I should say. They're both executives, and I'd moved up a little by then. They prided themselves on, and I believe were are world-class developers of talent. Um, they took a liking to me, helped me along, gave me positive and constructive feedback that I needed to hear. And that was great. And that really helped prepare me and enable me to be a good executive. And then things are going great. I've been at Starbucks for about 9 years. And then life happened and allowed me to gloss over the life event, in that it became important in my mind, for our entire family to leave Seattle and kind of the anything goes um, situation that's there with some things, some extracurricular activities. I just needed to get us out of Seattle. And at the same time, I got introduced to the then new CEO of a big company in Boise, Idaho. We used the same words to describe what we wanted from the strategic sourcing function. It turns out we meant different things, different things like how to approach versus, hardcore results versus relationship. How much
Mm-hmm.
of the preferred consultancy do we use versus hire? And that disagreement ended the way that disagreements with CEOs usually do, and that I was invited to move on, and that was fine because headhunters were still calling me. I took the package and took time to just be a father and husband and self and man again, and then COVID hit. I went, oh, everybody quit calling, and
Right.
so at that point, I'm like, okay, I've got to start networking with real intent, just not sell anything, just see what's out there. I've got to stay sharp. And I called and started talking to people I'd done business with. Talked to one guy who, when I was at Starbucks, he was a VP of sales at a big supplier. He'd moved on at a privately held company that, had some goals. And they said, hey, you know how procurement people think. Can you help us kind of behind the curtain anticipate what these big customers are going to say in this
Mm.
negotiation and help us out? Sure. And so, I'm helping them out and having fun, like got my brain back in the game. And about 3 months later, like, do you want to get paid? Oh yeah, that'd be cool. I wasn't worried about money at that time. I said, okay, how about X, like 10 grand or whatever? And they said, no, you need to send us an invoice. What do you mean? You need to form a company, so go to LegalZoom, blah blah blah, then invoices. So I did that. Sweated about which bank to use for 2 weeks until I finally just kind of got on with it. Like, okay, this isn't that hard. And so that was my first gig. It went well. From there, I picked up some contract work here or there with people that I used to work for here or there that knew me. And then about two and a half years into it, I had three proposals out. I needed one to keep the lights on. I wanted two to get ahead, but I got all
Mhm.
three. And when I got all three, I went, okay, now I need help. It's not just a one-man band anymore. So I reached into the network, found some other people that needed half, two-thirds time work. And we decided we can make a go of this thing. And so through a lot of trial and error and trying to hone our message, we realized, okay, people will look at our resumes and hire us for procurement stuff. So cost savings, architect your supply base, blah, 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 all those good things that I know inside and out. But I'm having a lot of fun helping sales teams at mid-market and medium-sized companies sell into the big guys. And the
Mhm.
reason that's so much fun for me is that in all those years as the big guy, I was doing great things for my company, but I could tell that a lot of value was being destroyed on Main Street when you
Yes.
can crush people with cost savings demands.
Yeah.
And I realized, okay, this is my chance to give back. And so to catch up to right now today, I help my clients improve their profits through better outcomes of their negotiations. And I've done personally 250, maybe 300 deals across a variety of industries, most on the buy side, but I've signed in as an executive another two or 300. I've now helped on the client side selling as well as selling my own services, maybe 40 or 50 occasions. And so I've gotten to use more tools in the toolbox and apply them in different ways. And so that's what I'm doing today. And there are some adjacencies that I won't bore you with on this thing on this podcast. But the net of all that is I got to a point where I've got something to give. I can help executives and sales teams and procurement teams at companies that are overworked, swamped by the tactical. They don't have time to really pull back and understand what their leverage is, how to increase it, how to exploit it, all those other
Mhm.
feel a bit more academic, but make a huge difference. I'm putting, maybe for 50 or 100 grand in fees, a million or $2 million annually back in people's pockets. And that feels good. And it's
Yeah.
so I'm the I'm an international deal maker and now selling that talent as a service. And
Well, I
I
was gonna
made it.
say you actually found your running fast. What was the little thing that made you unique or different? It's not supply chain, it's actually the experience of like how to sell into these companies and not lose your shirt, and so that's one of those things where a lot of times we go toward the most complicated, the hardest thing, but that's the simple thing. Not, but it's the simple thing for you. Like you understand this backwards and forwards that a lot of people don't understand, that we kind of just pass over as like, yeah, I know that. But it's like, no, that's actually a thing. Like
It is. And
the
what I've also
unseen
learned,
thing.
well, yeah, in big companies in procurement, we hear that your sales counterpart has way more training than you do.
Hmm.
Oops, looks like we're getting connect. Let me close a window or two here. We would hear how much better prepared sales would always be.
Hmm.
And okay, so in order to negotiate effectively, we've got to get better too. So we learned all of these um, procurement strategy, negotiation strategy, what leverage is, who your stakeholders are, how to look at the value chain, between dirt and dumpster, reverse logistics, the whole 9 yards. We got really good at that. And then I learned how to teach teams of increasingly large size, say even of 100, where your average talent is average, and then maybe they don't have a lot of experience, to learn how to get the whole team up to like B and B plus level work. What I found now working with medium sized down to mid market clients is they don't get the training. Like that was a fallacy that we told
Right.
ourselves.
Yes.
They're just out there trying to get it done.
Counting.
Sales says yes, pulls a pin, tosses a grenade into the S&OP process, and then everybody else is expected to scramble. And sometimes when I look at compensation systems, sales will be comped on revenue, not profit. They won't have
Right.
any focus on are you selling the stuff we know how to make, or are you selling the stuff we're going to have to figure out how to make? And
Hmm.
so when I noticed that, I was like, wait a minute, they need help. They may not know it, but I can help leadership and the sales guy go in way more prepared, understand how to do the backdoor selling, how to get the information that the buyer doesn't want you to have, and
Yeah.
how to do something with it. And I got to tell you, I'm having the time of my life
That's
with it.
awesome.
So anyway, I could go on, and I have, so but I'll pause there.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing all these stories. I like to end with just some rapid fire questions. So you pick a category: family and friends, money, spiritual, or health.
Money,
Okay. So
not
things
because
are,
it's most important.
yeah, exactly. It's been consistent. Things are actions I don't have that I want to have as far as money.
Things are actions. What I'm struggling with right now is how to become an effective salesperson. Because if I can't communicate in on the front end, then I can't
Hmm.
help them
Right.
make more money, and value doesn't flow to me. And so right now there's a personal capability gap that I'm trying to fill.
Interesting. And like the other kind so well, but the entrepreneurial selling is a whole different, yes, I'm with you. Things are actions I do have that I want to keep as far as money.
I'm a conservative guy when it comes to money, and I want to keep that on a personal level, but I've got to get better at taking risks in a small business. Because if you don't spend money, if you don't make the investment, which might feel like a bet, then you're never going to grow. Um, and I've got all the decision-making paradigms you could want to manage a portfolio of companies and or products or business units. But when it comes to this individual, when do I spend that $20,000 on XYZ that's going to help me out? I'm not very good at that. And so
Hmm.
that's a money related thing that I'm working through and learning right now.
Um, I think you answered the next one too. I don't have that I don't want. So yeah. Um, things or actions that I do have that I don't want as far as money.
I sweat the small stuff too much. It's probably the best way to say that
Yeah,
in short.
exactly. Great. So is there anything we didn't cover today that you want to make sure the audience walks away with, or something you want to emphasize?
Yes, and it comes back to money. I picked money intentionally because I learned late in life and the hard way that money is a tool. You need it to survive, um,
Hmm.
but avoid letting money become the end all be all for why you wake up in the morning, why you go to work. Avoid letting money be the determinant for why you do certain family things. Um, we all love money, but what I found is once you reach a certain point, the only thing that more money makes you want is even more money, and
Yeah.
it's a slippery slope into unhappiness. So um, be careful what you wish for.
I think that's great advice. Well, thank you so much for being on today and sharing your story. And I look forward to sharing this with our listeners.
Amy, thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
Yep. And now for my mindful moments with this interview with Jonathan Gardner. There's so many things to pluck out of this great interview, and so many things for us to really take those moments and think about in ourselves where we were influenced in our lives. And, we talked about Jonathan coming from a small town, but knowing he wanted a different life and not having that example directly in his life, but looking for all of the things around him that was going to show him the way of having a different life. Part of what we talked about was really understanding the world through books. And sometimes we don't think about the books that influenced us, and the books he brought up, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged from Ayn Rand, these books highly influenced me as well. And we forget how far the world has come in a short time period where I don't even realize the years that have gone by, that when I was younger, there just wasn't this look into the world and understanding beyond, before the internet, before social media, all of the things that exist today that make our children more worldly, and many of you that have grown up with it. However, we never had that perspective except what we saw on the news. And reading books like these when I was younger, and I always thought Ayn Rand was way beyond her years as an author. She envisioned women as powerful women in business, and there was just not many examples of that when I was younger. And I really, a lot of times, probably don't even realize when I'm thinking of those characters and how they had confidence in rooms of all men. And that is the shoes that I walk in. And I thought it was so interesting what he got out of it, of coming from a small town and really seeing commerce in a big way and how that works and so forth, when we had nowhere else to envision that from. And so I think those moments where we kind of look at what impacted us is so fascinating. And even more fascinating was the whole reason he read it was because of another student that was in his class that was a couple years older, that he thought knew how things worked and just seemed cool. And so he started modeling himself after looking up the things that that guy did in order to be able to accomplish what he wanted in his life. And that guy had recommended these books. Now, again, I just find these things fascinating, and these stories that we get to uncover on this podcast, that a lot of times there's these people that come into our lives for whatever reason and make the biggest impact on us, and they never know. He's moved on. His friend Marty has moved on in his life. and Jonathan's moved on. And it's those moments of remembering who has impacted you and pivoted your life's path. And there was some reason that you were put together in order to learn those lessons. And that really made him curious about the world, where he wanted to be in international business, and went and got his MBA and understood international business from that perspective, learned Spanish, had a love for Spanish and the language, and took one of his first jobs in Brazil, which is actually Portuguese, which he learned as a language as well. But instead of doing things in a small way, he went to a huge company and learned how a big company works and the bureaucracy around it. But where he had grown up in small business and having small business jobs where everybody does everything, when you're learning how to silo jobs and how you've got to connect with others in order to do that. Now, his next job, Dell, we spent a good amount of time on, and I think it's, what really stuck was his 360, where they assessed whether he was a strategic thinker versus a tactical thinker. And I know I do this too, and probably many of you do. He had everybody except one person say he was strategic, but he focused on the one person that said something different because it bothered him. Why was there that outlier? And that boss that he had was another person that really shifted his path and pivoted it to change his perspective on what strategic thinking means. Strategic thinking is not just the work that we do. It is also the relationships that we make so that the work that we do can happen. And without those relationships, we often get frustrated with people. There's a lack of communication. I see this all of the time in my coaching clients, that it really just takes a conversation or getting to know someone outside of the actual work, where it's just to go to lunch or to go for a coffee or ask them to go to an event, so that you get to know people personally. And the reason that this becomes important is because when you personally know somebody, when there are opportunities or things that you need or things that they're looking for, they look at you differently, because you now have a relationship where you know each other at a human level, and it is more caring. When people feel they are seen, they're more apt to be able to help you when you need it, and you're able to help them because you want to help them as well, and you just understand them in a different way. So even when you're having those frustrating days, your level of being triggered by that person may be different because you understand them at a different level. So I think it's really important to understand the importance of relationships in our lives and at work in order to accomplish the things. We can be the most technically sound subject matter expert, but without those relationships, it's very hard to push through to the next level. And that is strategic thinking. It isn't tactical. It's that you have those relationships for when you do need it. And I thought that was really the first time I had heard that explained in that way. And it was such a great thing to think about. So I hope you took some things away from this podcast, that his story on here, and he was so transparent and really helped us to understand his journey of when things were going great and when things weren't going so great, and what he learned from that, and how that's really brought him to today and the work that he does, and really finding that thing that he does well, but he didn't even realize that it was something that was an expertise. And so many of us have these things that we are experts in that we don't give credit to, that other people need. So take that as inspiration today and really figure out maybe one or two people to reach out to. And also, what is that thing that you might be ignoring that's your expertise, but it is? These are the things that we do during our coaching sessions at the B3 Method Institute. And if you haven't looked into them yet, definitely go to businessbalancebliss.com. There is information right on there about it. On our website, amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast, you will see discount codes for group coaching just for our podcast listeners. And during this group coaching, we help you to uncover these blind spots so that you can be able to push through and get to the goals that you want to be able to accomplish. Not only do we help you, but you have a community of support in these groups as well. So I hope that you'll look into it, be inspired by Jonathan's story, and listen to our next episode when it comes out with other life lessons that may help you as well. Make sure to share, subscribe to this podcast. It helps our podcast as well as other people to be able to learn these lessons as well. And just remember that when we are intentional about the energy that we create, we give a gift to everybody around us. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.